Welcome back, dear listener. In the last part of our journey, we explored the origins of the geisha, their beginnings, their early traditions, and the fragile foundations of a world that would soon become timeless. Now, in this new chapter, we step deeper into their story. Together we will discover how their training grew more rigorous, how their communities formed stronger bonds, and how the floating world began to shape not only entertainment, but the very culture of Japan. So, wherever you are listening from, and whatever time it is for you, make yourself comfortable, take a deep breath, and let us continue our journey into the elegant and mysterious world of the geisha. The final decades of the 19th century marked the twilight of the Edo period and the dawn of the Meiji era. For the geisha, this was both an ending and a beginning, a time when the familiar rhythms of their world gave way to the unknown currents of modernization. The floating world that had shaped them was fading, yet the values they embodied, refinement, elegance, impermanence, were needed more than ever in a society caught between past and future. The collapse of the Tokugawa shogunate in 1868 was more than a political revolution. It was a transformation of the entire social fabric of Japan. Samurai lost their hereditary privileges, merchants gained influence, new industries flourished, and Western technologies and fashions flooded into cities. The sight of men in bowler hats and women in Western gowns became increasingly common, signaling that Japan was eager to join the global stage. In this whirlwind of change, the geisha appeared as paradoxical figures, relics of the past to some, but to others, living symbols of continuity. Their profession survived precisely because of its adaptability. Unlike the courtesans, whose elaborate rituals and rigid structures collapsed under the weight of modernization, geisha embraced transformation without abandoning essence. They adjusted their repertoire, occasionally including Western instruments alongside shamisen or weaving foreign melodies into their performances. They modified their attire subtly, blending Western fabrics into their traditional kimono. They welcomed new types of patrons, industrialists, bureaucrats, even foreign dignitaries, into their ozashiki. Yet through all this, they preserved the core of their art, the creation of atmosphere, the embodiment of refinement, the fleeting brilliance of impermanence. For many Japanese, the geisha became symbols of national identity in a time when identity itself was uncertain. The Meiji government sought to modernize rapidly, adopting Western technologies and institutions while preserving cultural pride. Geisha were enlisted, sometimes informally, as representatives of this cultural pride. Their presence at gatherings signaled that Japan could modernize without abandoning its soul, that the elegance of tradition could stand alongside the machinery of progress. This symbolic role extended into diplomacy. Foreign visitors to Japan were often entertained by geisha, who introduced them to Japanese music, dance, and conversation. To these outsiders, the geisha became the face of Japan itself. Mysterious, refined, and distinct from anything they had known at home. Though misunderstandings persisted, many still confused geisha with courtesans. The impression they left was lasting. Geisha became ambassadors of culture, embodying the refinement that Japan sought to display to the world. Within Japan, the Meiji transformation reshaped the structure of geisha life. The ukiyo system persisted, but its economic foundations shifted. Patrons were no longer exclusively samurai and merchants. They now included politicians, industrialists, and wealthy entrepreneurs. Debts and obligations remained, but the sources of income diversified as geisha adapted to new contexts. Dance schools expanded, codifying traditions into formal curricula. Performances became more structured, sometimes staged for larger audiences rather than confined to intimate banquets. In this way, geisha culture transitioned from a purely private world into a semi-public institution of cultural preservation. Festivals, too, took on new importance. As Japan sought to present itself as both modern and traditional, public appearances by geisha became central to the narrative of continuity. They danced in festivals that were framed as heritage events, their presence assuring citizens that amid railways, telegraphs, and Western schools, the rhythms of the seasons still held meaning. In these settings, geisha were not only entertainers, but cultural guardians, linking modern Japan to its past. The tension between tradition and transformation defined their lives. On one hand, geisha embraced novelty, ensuring their relevance in a rapidly changing society. On the other, they clung to the principles of refinement that distinguished them: restraint over spectacle, suggestion over display, impermanence over permanence. Their art survived because it resonated with values deeper than fashion, values that modernization could not erase. Yet the challenges were immense. Some critics saw geisha as outdated, relics of a fading world. Others feared that the economic and social changes of modernization would erode their profession entirely. The decline of courtesans fueled these fears, for many assumed that geisha would share their fate. But time and again, the geisha proved resilient. Where courtesans resisted change, geisha absorbed it. Where others clung to rigidity, geisha embraced fluidity. Their adaptability became their salvation. For the women themselves, this adaptability demanded sacrifice. They bore the weight of expectation not only from their ukiyo and patrons, but from a nation anxious about its identity. They were asked to embody tradition, to reassure citizens that Japan's cultural soul endured, while simultaneously adjusting to the tastes of a modernizing elite. This dual burden was exhausting, yet many geisha embraced it with pride, seeing themselves as custodians of beauty in a time of upheaval. By the close of the 19th century, the geisha stood as survivors of transformation. The lanterns of the old floating world had dimmed, but new lights had risen, and the geisha walked among them. They remained artists of impermanence, their evenings of laughter and music still unfolding in tatami rooms, their presence still weaving atmosphere. Their art still reminding guests that beauty need not be permanent to endure. The golden age had carried them into modernity. It was an age of flourishing art, of cultural prominence, of symbolic weight. And though the world around them changed beyond recognition, the geisha endured, living blossoms in the garden of Japan's identity, reminders that even amid progress, impermanence, and elegance remained eternal truths. As Japan opened its doors to the outside world in the late 19th century, the image of the geisha began to travel far beyond the lantern-lit alleys of Kyoto or the tea-houses of Edo. Foreign diplomats, merchants, and travelers encountered them firsthand, while artists and writers carried their impressions abroad. For the West, the geisha quickly became a symbol of Japan itself. Mysterious, delicate, refined, and exotic. Yet this transformation brought both fascination and misunderstanding, shaping perceptions that continue to echo even today. Western visitors often encountered geisha in diplomatic or ceremonial contexts. Entertaining foreign dignitaries with dances, music, and conversation, geisha served as informal ambassadors of Japanese culture. Their presence signaled that Japan was not merely adopting Western technologies, but also preserving its traditions. To a diplomat sipping tea while listening to shamisen melodies, the geisha embodied the elegance of a nation eager to present itself as both modern and deeply rooted in heritage. But Western eyes, unfamiliar with the subtleties of geisha art, frequently misinterpreted what they saw. Many assumed that geisha were courtesans, equating their presence with intimacy rather than artistry. The distinction so carefully maintained within Japanese society between courtesan and geisha, indulgence and refinement, possession and presence, were often lost in translation. Travelogues and memoirs written by foreigners described geisha as women of pleasure, overlooking the discipline, training, and cultural significance that defined their profession. These misunderstandings were not entirely accidental. Some Japanese hosts, eager to accommodate foreign expectations, blurred the lines themselves, presenting geisha in ways that aligned with Western fantasies. Artists and publishers, too, catered to foreign demand by producing images of geisha that emphasized sensuality rather than refinement. In this way, the Western image of the geisha was shaped as much by projection as by reality, creating myths that diverged from the truth, yet fascination persisted. Painters of the European Impressionist movement, captivated by Japanese prints and aesthetics, often incorporated geisha imagery into their works. Writers described them in poems and stories, presenting them as mysterious figures of beauty and grace. Even fashion in the West was influenced, as kimono-inspired garments and hairstyles reminiscent of geisha styles entered European salons. The geisha became part of a global imagination, symbols of a Japan that was at once admired, and for the geisha themselves, this foreign fascination was both flattering and troubling. On one hand, it elevated their profession, granting them international recognition and reinforcing their role as cultural custodians. On the other, it distorted their identity, reducing their complex art to simplistic stereotypes. To be seen as courtesans rather than artists was a misrepresentation that many resented, even as they continued to perform for foreign guests. Within Japan, the spread of these Western perceptions created new dynamics. Some geisha adapted their performances to suit foreign audiences, incorporating explanations of their art or modifying their repertoire to highlight elements that outsiders could appreciate more easily. Others resisted, insisting on maintaining traditions regardless of how they were misunderstood. The tension between authenticity and adaptation mirrored the broader challenges faced by Japan itself as it navigated modernization and international recognition. Despite the misunderstandings, the geisha's role as cultural ambassador carried undeniable significance. Their presence reassured Japanese citizens that, even as railways were built and factories rose, the soul of their nation remained intact. To the world, geisha signaled that Japan was more than machines and commerce. It was a land of refinement, of beauty, of values rooted in impermanence. This dual role, symbol within Japan, symbol abroad, placed immense pressure on geisha. They bore the weight of expectation not only from their patrons and ukiyo, but from a nation anxious about its identity. and from foreigners eager for a vision of exotic beauty. Their gestures, their songs, their attire carried meanings that extended far beyond the tea house, shaping perceptions of an entire culture. And yet the geisha endured, as they always had, by balancing adaptability with essence. They allowed their image to travel, even when distorted, knowing that their true art survived in the quiet intimacy of ozashiki banquets, in the subtle laughter of a festival dance, in the whispered verses of poetry. They were symbols not only because others made them so, but because they embodied values that transcended misunderstanding. Elegance, refinement, impermanence. The golden age of geisha was thus also the beginning of their global presence. From the streets of Kyoto to the salons of Paris, from the tea houses of Edo to the imaginations of writers and painters abroad, the geisha became part of the world's vision of Japan. Misunderstood, romanticized, admired, and exoticized, they nevertheless carried forward their art, reminding both Japan and the wider world that beauty lies not in possession, but in presence, not in permanence, but in the fleeting brilliance of a moment. The golden age of the geisha was more than a chapter in the history of Japanese entertainment. It was a culmination of centuries of refinement, adaptation, and resilience. By the close of the 19th century, the geisha had become an institution recognized not only within Japan, but across the world. Their presence had transcended the boundaries of the floating world, shaping fashion, inspiring art, influencing politics, and embodying the very soul of Japanese aesthetics. Yet their triumph was inseparable from the challenges they endured, challenges that defined both their fragility and their strength. At the heart of this legacy was their mastery of impermanence. The geisha's art was ephemeral, existing only in the fleeting brilliance of an evening. The shamisen note that trembled in the air, the dance that unfolded across tatami mats, the witty remark that dissolved into laughter, all vanished as soon as they appeared. Yet this impermanence was not weakness, but strength, aligning their art with the deepest currents of Japanese philosophy. In a world obsessed with permanence and possession, the geisha reminded all who encountered them that beauty lies in transience, that meaning is found not in what endures, but in what passes. Their golden age also demonstrated the power of adaptability. From their beginnings as successors to the male taikomochi, to their distinction from courtesans, to their role as symbols of national identity in the Meiji era, geisha survived by adjusting to change without abandoning essence. They absorbed novelty, new fashions, new patrons, even foreign influences, while preserving the values that defined them: refinement, restraint, harmony, and grace. This adaptability ensured their endurance, allowing them to carry their art into the modern age even as other professions of the floating world disappeared. Economically, the Golden Age revealed both the burdens and the resilience of geisha life. The debts of ukiyo, the expenses of kimono and training, the reliance on patrons all created immense pressures. Yet geisha navigated these with discipline and ingenuity, transforming financial obligation into a structure that preserved their traditions. Their survival was not accidental, but the result of systems that balanced hardship with opportunity, ensuring that their art could endure, even under strain. Socially, the geisha of the Golden Age achieved visibility unmatched by most women of their time. In a society that confined women largely to domestic spaces, the geisha moved freely through the worlds of merchants, samurai, politicians, and even foreigners. Their wit and intellect gave them a voice in conversations otherwise closed to women, while their presence created spaces of equality that temporarily dissolved rigid hierarchies. They were both constrained by rules and liberated by their art, their paradoxical position granting them influence far beyond what their official status allowed. Culturally, their impact was immense. They shaped fashion, defined standards of beauty, inspired painters and poets, and became central to the philosophy of impermanence. Their presence in ukiyo prints ensured that their image reached households across Japan, while their appearances in festivals tied them to the rhythms of community life. For many, they were the face of refinement, the living symbols of values that defined Japanese identity. Internationally, their image spread as Japan entered the global stage. Misunderstood, romanticized, and exoticized, the geisha nevertheless became the most recognizable symbol of Japanese femininity abroad. They were seen by Westerners as embodiments of a mysterious and refined culture, even as their true identity was often lost in translation. This global fascination reinforced their symbolic role at home, reminding Japan that its traditions were admired even as it modernized. Yet the Golden Age was also marked by fragility. Behind the serene smile and elegant kimono lay exhaustion, sacrifice, and struggle. Geisha carried debts that bound them to ukiyo, endured long hours of training and performance, and faced personal limitations that curtailed their freedom. Their careers were fleeting, their youth short-lived, their influence constrained by the demands of patrons and society. The very impermanence that defined their art also defined their lives, leaving many to fade into obscurity once their brilliance had passed. Still, it was this combination of fragility and resilience that gave the geisha their enduring power. They were blossoms that bloomed briefly yet brilliantly, leaving impressions that outlasted their own time. They were guardians of tradition who carried values into an uncertain future. They were symbols of a nation navigating the delicate balance between continuity and change. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the golden age of geisha stood as both culmination and threshold. The world around them had transformed. Samurai were gone, factories rose, railways spread, Western clothes and ideas mingled with Japanese traditions. Yet, in the lantern glow of Gion, in the music of shamisen drifting through Shinbashi, in the laughter of ozashiki banquets, the geisha endured. Their art remained, not untouched by change but alive within it, adapting yet preserving, fleeting yet eternal. The Golden Age left a legacy that would shape the geisha's future. It proved that their art could survive upheaval, that their profession could embody both tradition and transformation, that their presence could reassure a nation in flux. It established them not merely as entertainers, but as cultural custodians, living embodiments of refinement, impermanence, and grace. And so, as Japan stepped into the modern age, the geisha carried with them the memory of their golden era, a time when they defined beauty, inspired art, influenced politics, and represented the soul of a nation. Their story was far from over, but the Golden Age would remain forever a touchstone, a reminder of what they had achieved, of the heights they had reached, of the blossoms they had become in the garden of Japanese history. The fall of the Tokugawa shogunate in 1868 and the rise of the Meiji government marked one of the most transformative periods in Japanese history. Samurai lost their status, new industries blossomed, and Western technologies and fashions spread rapidly across the nation. Cities filled with railways, telegraphs, and factories, while schools introduced Western-style education. In this whirlwind of modernization, many traditional aspects of Japanese life faded or were swept aside. Yet, amid this storm, the geisha endured. The survival of the geisha during the Meiji era was not inevitable. Like the courtesans before them, they might easily have vanished under the pressures of change. But unlike the courtesans, the geisha had always defined themselves not by rigid rituals, but by adaptability. Their art was fluid, capable of absorbing novelty while preserving essence. And so, as Japan opened itself to the world, the geisha found ways to remain relevant, positioning themselves as both entertainers and cultural custodians in a modern age. The Meiji government, eager to present Japan as a strong and civilized nation to the West, paradoxically reinforced the geisha's symbolic role. While some criticized them as relics of the past, others celebrated them as living embodiments of Japanese refinement. Foreign dignitaries who visited Japan were often entertained by geisha, who introduced them to traditional music, dance, and conversation. In these moments, the geisha became cultural ambassadors, reassuring the world that Japan's soul endured even as its infrastructure transformed. For the geisha themselves, the Meiji era brought new patrons. Samurai, once central to their world, had lost their privileges. In their place rose industrialists, bureaucrats, and wealthy merchants who had thrived under modernization. These new patrons valued refinement as much as their predecessors. But they also brought different expectations. Some wanted novelty, asking geisha to incorporate Western instruments or melodies into their performances. Others sought the reassurance of tradition, requesting dances and songs that evoked the timeless beauty of Japan. The geisha adapted to both, weaving continuity and change into their art. Their attire reflected this balance. While geisha continued to wear kimono, some incorporated Western fabrics, experimenting with silks imported from abroad. Hairstyles, too, shifted subtly, influenced by changing fashions, yet retaining the distinctive ornaments that marked their profession. Makeup remained traditional, but accessories occasionally included Western-inspired touches. These adaptations demonstrated the geisha's ability to remain rooted in tradition while acknowledging the transformations of their age. The ukiyo system also persisted, though its economic foundations evolved. With new types of patrons came new forms of financial support. Dance schools expanded, formalizing the training of geisha and ensuring continuity across generations. Performances became more structured, sometimes staged for larger audiences beyond the intimate ozashiki banquets. These changes positioned geisha not only as private entertainers, but as participants in the preservation of cultural heritage. The Meiji government itself recognized the symbolic value of geisha. While officials pushed for modernization, they also sought to define and preserve certain traditions as markers of national identity. Geisha culture, with its emphasis on refinement, impermanence, and harmony, became part of this narrative. They were presented as proof that Japan could modernize without abandoning its soul, that the elegance of tradition could stand alongside the machinery of progress. Yet challenges abounded. Critics accused geisha of being outdated, relics of a past that modernization should erase. Others feared that their proximity to foreigners would dilute their traditions or tarnish their reputation. The debts and obligations of the ukiyo remained heavy, and many geisha struggled to balance the demands of patrons with the pressures of cultural expectation. Their lives were no less disciplined, no less constrained than in the Edo period. Still, resilience defined them. The geisha of the Meiji era endured by embracing paradox. They were at once traditional and modern, private entertainers and public symbols, women bound by rules yet celebrated for their art. Their adaptability ensured that they remained central to Japanese cultural life, even as the world around them changed beyond recognition. By the end of the 19th century, the geisha stood as survivors of transformation. The courtesans had vanished, the floating world had dimmed, but the geisha endured, refined, resilient, and rooted in values that modernization could not erase. They carried forward the legacy of their golden age into a new century, embodying the delicate balance between continuity and change. Daily life for a geisha in the Meiji era was a careful balance between tradition and adaptation. The rhythms of apprenticeship, training, and performance had not vanished with the fall of the shogunate. Instead, they deepened, becoming more structured, more formalized, and increasingly tied to institutions designed to preserve Japanese culture in an age of rapid change. The ukiyo remained the central hub of geisha life. Girls still entered these houses as shikomi apprentices, performing chores, observing their elders, and beginning the long journey toward becoming maiko and eventually geisha. The presence of the okasan, the house mother, was as commanding as ever. She managed finances, arranged engagements, negotiated with patrons, and oversaw the progress of apprentices. Yet the financial pressures of modernization meant that the ukiyo operated with even greater vigilance, tracking debts and earnings with precision, ensuring that each investment in kimono, training, and performance would be repaid. Training itself became increasingly formalized. In the Edo period, much of a geisha's education had been overseen within the ukiyo itself, guided by senior sisters and occasional instructors. By the Meiji era, specialized dance and music schools emerged, codifying traditions and establishing formal curricula. These schools were often affiliated with major districts like Kyoto's Gion or Tokyo's Shimbashi, ensuring consistency in the arts of shamisen, dance, and song. For apprentices, this meant long hours of disciplined study, often beginning before dawn and continuing until the evening banquets. Shamisen practice remained central. In dimly lit classrooms, rows of young maiko sat with their instruments, plucking strings under the watchful eye of instructors. The music was both old and new. Ancient pieces passed down for generations, alongside newer compositions reflecting the changing tastes of the Meiji audience. The subtle tremor of a note, the precise timing of rhythm, the delicate interplay of melody and silence, each demanded mastery. For many apprentices, the shamisen became both companion and burden, an instrument that required devotion yet offered a path to artistry. Dance instruction carried equal weight. Unlike Western dance, which emphasized large movements and spectacle, the geisha's art of dance was grounded in restraint, suggestion, and refinement. The Meiji era saw these traditions formalized into distinct schools, each with its own style, repertoire, and philosophy. Students practiced tirelessly, their bodies bending into precise postures, their hands moving with deliberate elegance, their expressions trained to convey entire stories through the smallest gestures. Seasonal dances remained central, each performance tied to the cycles of nature, reminding both performer and audience of the impermanence of beauty. Other skills were added to the curriculum as well. Calligraphy lessons refined not only handwriting but the sense of aesthetic balance. Poetry composition, particularly haiku and tanka, remained essential, teaching apprentices to capture fleeting moments in words as well as in dance or song. Conversation was practiced as an art, with instructors coaching apprentices on how to listen attentively, respond with wit, and steer discussions gracefully. In an era when Japan was increasingly engaging with the West, some geisha even learned fragments of foreign languages or acquired knowledge of foreign customs, preparing them for encounters with international guests. The process of apprenticeship still followed the progression from shikomi to maiko to geisha. Shikomi apprentices performed menial tasks, cleaning rooms, preparing meals, and attending to senior geisha. Their long days included hours of observation, watching their elder sisters prepare for banquets, absorbing unspoken lessons in gesture, attire, and demeanor. When deemed ready, a shikomi underwent the formal ceremony of becoming a maiko, taking on elaborate hairstyles, colorful kimono, and the role of assistant to a senior geisha. The bond between onisan and imuto, older and younger sisters, remained vital. The senior geisha guided her apprentice not only in the technical arts, but in the subtleties of presence, timing, and intuition. She taught her when to speak and when to remain silent, how to shift the mood of a room, how to balance grace with wit. These lessons, often unspoken, were as crucial as any formal training, for they prepared the apprentice for the intangible art of atmosphere that defined the geisha's profession. The daily routine of a geisha in the Meiji era reflected both continuity and change. Mornings were filled with lessons, shamisen, dance, calligraphy, poetry, and etiquette. Afternoons were dedicated to rehearsals and preparations, from selecting kimono to practicing hairstyles. Evenings brought ozashiki banquets, where the day's training was transformed into performance. Nights stretched late, leaving little time for rest before the cycle began anew. The discipline was relentless, the sacrifices immense. Yet the rewards, prestige, influence, and the possibility of independence, remained powerful incentives. Modernization introduced new challenges to this daily rhythm. Western-style clothing and entertainment began to compete with traditional forms, drawing some audiences away from tea houses. To remain relevant, geisha adapted, emphasizing the cultural depth of their art. Dance schools staged public performances that highlighted tradition as heritage, framing geisha not only as entertainers, but as preservers of national identity. In this way, the daily training of apprentices was tied not only to personal success, but to the survival of an entire cultural institution. Despite the hardships, many geisha found pride in their roles. They saw themselves as custodians of elegance in a world rushing toward change, guardians of values that modernization threatened to erase. Their daily routines, though exhausting, gave them purpose, binding them to a lineage of artistry that stretched back generations. Each shamisen note, each measured step, each gesture refined over countless hours. was a testament to their resilience. The life of a geisha in the Meiji era was thus both demanding and meaningful. It preserved the continuity of tradition while adapting to the demands of modernity. It required endless sacrifice, yet it offered prestige and pride. It was, like the art itself, an embodiment of impermanence. Fleeting in youth, brilliant in its prime, fading with time, yet enduring in memory. The Meiji era was a time of profound economic transformation for Japan, and the geisha world was no exception. As industries expanded, railways crisscrossed the land, and cities filled with factories and markets. The structures that had sustained the floating world for centuries were challenged. Yet geisha culture, long rooted in financial discipline and patronage, adapted with remarkable resilience. The debts, the ukiyo system, the role of dana patrons, all evolved under the pressures of modernization, reshaping the economics of geisha life. The ukiyo remained at the center of financial life. Each geisha house functioned as both home and economic institution, managing debts, earnings, and expenses with careful precision. The costs of training a geisha had not diminished. Indeed, they had grown. Kimono remained expensive, and with the availability of imported fabrics and dyes, costs sometimes soared higher than in the Edo period. Shamisen lessons, dance schools, calligraphy training, all required payment to instructors whose own livelihoods depended on the patronage of geisha culture. The okasan of each ukiyo bore these expenses initially, keeping meticulous records of every coin spent, confident that the investment would be repaid when the apprentice matured into a successful geisha. For the apprentice, this meant entering the profession already burdened with debt. Every banquet, every engagement, every performance was not simply an artistic act, but a financial obligation. The elegance seen by patrons was underpinned by ledgers of expenses, debts that might take years or an entire career to repay. The grace of a shamisen note, the sweep of a kimono sleeve, the laughter in an ozashiki, all were sustained by an invisible network of financial calculations. In this system, the role of the dana became increasingly significant. A dana was more than a wealthy admirer. He was a patron who provided substantial financial support, often covering a geisha's debts, the costs of her attire, and the fees for her training. In return, he received exclusivity of companionship, though the nature of this companionship varied. For some, it meant emotional intimacy. For others, it was primarily a relationship of prestige, a symbol of refinement and status. The Meiji era reshaped this role in notable ways. With the decline of the samurai class, who had once been frequent patrons, new elites emerged as potential dana. Industrialists, bankers, and government officials filled the vacuum, bringing with them different expectations and tastes. Some appreciated the continuity of traditional geisha culture, seeking reassurance that Japan's refinement persisted amid modernization. Others encouraged novelty, asking geisha to experiment with Western fabrics, to perform for international guests, or to incorporate foreign elements into their repertoire. Geisha adapted accordingly, balancing the desires of their new patrons with the preservation of their own traditions. For the geisha, securing a dana could mean freedom. With debts repaid and expenses covered, she gained independence from the financial constraints of the ukiyo, allowing her to focus more fully on her art. Some achieved stability and even wealth through such arrangements, becoming celebrated figures within their districts. Yet this dependence also carried risks. A patron might lose his fortune, withdraw his support, or demand compromises that threatened the geisha's autonomy. Navigating these relationships required subtlety, intuition, and resilience. The broader economy of the floating world also evolved in the Meiji era. Tea houses, ochaya, became more formalized businesses, regulated by authorities eager to ensure order in an era of modernization. Kimono makers, hairdressers, and artisans continued to thrive on geisha patronage. But they too adapted to new markets, blending traditional craftsmanship with Western-inspired techniques. The floating world became both a refuge of tradition and a participant in economic modernization. Its survival depended on its ability to remain profitable as well as beautiful. Festivals and public appearances added further economic dimensions. Geisha performances at seasonal events drew crowds that stimulated local economies, filling inns, tea houses, and markets. Their visibility in such contexts reinforced their role not only as cultural custodians, but also as engines of economic activity. Cities like Kyoto and Tokyo benefited from the prestige and commerce associated with their geisha districts, which became destinations for both Japanese travelers and foreign visitors. Despite these adaptations, the economic burdens remained heavy for many geisha. Not every apprentice secured a wealthy patron, not every geisha achieved fame. For those less fortunate, debts could linger indefinitely. Their lives shaped more by financial struggle than by artistic triumph. The disparity between celebrated geisha, immortalized in prints and stories, and the countless others who labored in obscurity, revealed the harsh realities that lay beneath the elegance of the profession. Yet even in hardship, there was pride. To succeed as a geisha in the Meiji era was to demonstrate not only artistic refinement, but economic resilience. The ability to navigate debts, patrons, and shifting markets was itself an art, one that required as much discipline as dance or music. Guests might see only the elegance of performance, but beneath the surface lay a mastery of survival, a strength forged in the crucible of financial obligation. The Meiji era thus underscored the duality of geisha life: art sustained by economics, beauty underpinned by debt, refinement inseparable from survival. It was a world where every shamisen note was both melody and repayment, every dance both performance and financial necessity. Yet within this duality lay the enduring strength of the geisha, who transformed constraint into elegance, hardship into artistry, debt into discipline. As Japan moved deeper into the modern age, the economics of the geisha world continued to evolve. But the lessons of the Meiji era endured: that survival depended on adaptability, that beauty could flourish even amid financial burden, and that the geisha's art was as much about resilience as it was about refinement. The Meiji era was not only a time of political and economic upheaval, it was also a period of intense cultural negotiation. Japan, having opened its doors to the West, faced the challenge of proving itself as a modern nation while preserving the essence of its traditions. In this delicate balance, the geisha found themselves at the heart of Japan's cultural diplomacy. Their role extended beyond the tea house and into the realm of national identity, making them both entertainers and ambassadors. Foreign dignitaries arriving in Japan were often introduced to geisha as part of their cultural initiation. Banquets hosted for diplomats, businessmen, and journalists frequently included performances of shamisen music, seasonal dances, and poetry recitations. To these visitors, the geisha embodied the refinement and elegance of Japan, offering an image that contrasted with the smokestacks of factories and the clamor of railways. The geisha reassured the world that modernization had not erased tradition, that Japan's spirit of refinement endured. This diplomatic role was not accidental. The Meiji government, aware of the symbolic value of geisha, often facilitated their presence at official events. While samurai armor and Shinto rituals displayed Japan's history and religion, geisha displayed its living culture. Art, music, and refinement embodied in human form. Their appearance alongside politicians and industrial leaders created a narrative of balance. Japan could master Western technology while cherishing its own aesthetic heritage. For the geisha themselves, this role demanded adaptation. Entertaining foreigners was different from entertaining Japanese patrons, who were attuned to the subtleties of gesture, seasonality, and mono no aware. Foreign guests, unfamiliar with these traditions, required explanations and adjustments. Some geisha began to learn fragments of English or French, enough to greet guests or explain the basics of their art. Others relied on interpreters, but adjusted their performances to highlight what outsiders could most easily appreciate: the visual elegance of kimono, the haunting sound of shamisen, the graceful flow of dance. Misunderstandings were frequent. Many foreigners equated geisha with courtesans, unable to distinguish between intimacy and artistry. Travel accounts often described them as women of pleasure rather than artists of refinement. These misconceptions frustrated some geisha, who felt their discipline and traditions were being diminished. Yet others saw opportunity in the fascination, recognizing that even in misunderstanding, the geisha's image enhanced Japan's allure abroad. Indeed, the West became captivated by geisha imagery. Ukiyo prints featuring geisha were exported to Europe and America, where they inspired impressionist painters and collectors. Writers incorporated geisha into poems and stories, presenting them as exotic symbols of a mysterious East. Fashion houses in Paris and London drew inspiration from geisha attire, creating garments that echoed the lines of kimono. The geisha, whether accurately understood or not, had become Japan's most recognizable cultural icon. Within Japan, this global fascination influenced how geisha presented themselves. Some districts leaned into the role of cultural ambassadors, emphasizing tradition and heritage in their performances for both domestic and foreign audiences. Others experimented with incorporating Western elements, blending novelty with refinement. In both cases, the geisha demonstrated their adaptability, ensuring their survival in a rapidly changing cultural landscape. Their role in diplomacy also reinforced their symbolic position at home. Ordinary Japanese citizens, reading newspapers or hearing stories of geisha entertaining foreign dignitaries, saw in them a source of national pride. They were not only entertainers for the wealthy, but representatives of Japan itself. Women whose art carried the weight of identity. This perception elevated the geisha further, giving them a significance that extended beyond the floating world. Yet the pressures were immense. To embody the identity of a nation was no small burden. Geisha were expected to maintain flawless appearance, impeccable manners, and unerring grace, not only for their patrons, but for the image of Japan itself. A misstep in performance could be interpreted as a flaw in national character. The responsibility weighed heavily, even as it offered prestige. Despite these pressures, many geisha embraced the role with pride. They saw themselves as custodians of tradition in an era of change, guardians of beauty in a world rushing toward industrialization. Their performances for foreign guests were not simply entertainment, but acts of cultural preservation, reminders that Japan's soul could not be measured in machines or railways, but in the fleeting brilliance of art. The Meiji era thus transformed geisha into more than private entertainers. They became symbols of Japan's cultural identity, ambassadors in the quiet diplomacy of refinement. Through their music, their dances, their gestures, they conveyed a message more powerful than speeches or treaties. That beauty mattered, that tradition endured, that impermanence itself could be a strength. As lanterns glowed in the alleys of Gion and the streets of Shinbashi, as foreign dignitaries marveled at the elegance of their hosts, the geisha of the Meiji era stood as bridges between past and future, between Japan and the world. Their art, fragile yet resilient, became a language through which Japan spoke to itself and to others, a language of beauty, impermanence, and grace. Behind the lantern-lit tea houses and the graceful performances of the Meiji era, geisha lay a more private and complicated reality. While their public image as custodians of elegance grew stronger, their personal lives were marked by discipline, constraint, and the constant negotiation between tradition and the changes of a modernizing society. To glimpse their inner world is to see the paradox of women who lived at once as symbols of freedom and beauty, and as individuals bound tightly by duty and expectation. The ukiyo remained the anchor of geisha life. Within these houses, young girls entered as shikomi, burdened with chores and rules, their days filled with tasks that prepared them for the discipline of artistry. Though modernization reshaped much of Japan, the ukiyo maintained its rigid structures. The authority of the okasan was unquestionable. She managed not only the financial debts of her wards, but also their personal choices. Whether a geisha might accept a patron, whether she could invest in a new kimono, even whether she could attend certain social events, all passed through the okasan's oversight. This control often extended into the personal realm. While marriage remained largely forbidden, companionship with a dana offered the closest equivalent to partnership. Yet these relationships, though sometimes affectionate, were rarely equal. A patron held economic power, and with it the ability to influence or even dictate the course of a geisha's life. Some relationships blossomed into lasting emotional bonds. Others were pragmatic, designed to alleviate debts or secure stability. For the geisha, love and livelihood were often entangled, making personal freedom difficult to achieve. Despite these constraints, bonds of sisterhood within the ukiyo provided moments of intimacy and support. The relationship between senior geisha and their maiko apprentices was both educational and emotional, shaping the identity of younger women through guidance, encouragement, and shared struggles. Late at night, after banquets had ended and kimono had been carefully folded away, geisha and maiko might gather in quiet corners to share laughter, stories, and dreams. In these private moments, the burdens of performance lifted, revealing women who longed, like all others, for connection and recognition beyond their roles. Family ties outside the ukiyo were complex. Many geisha had been sent into the profession by parents who hoped the income and prestige might lift the family from poverty. While some maintained close relationships with their relatives, others grew distant, their lives so consumed by training and performance that ties weakened. Modernization sometimes deepened this distance. Families adopted Western ways, while geisha clung to traditions, creating cultural as well as personal divides. Yet even in estrangement, the sense of obligation remained. Many geisha sent money to support their parents or siblings, fulfilling duties that extended beyond their own hardships. The daily lives of geisha in the Meiji era were marked by fatigue as much as refinement. Long hours of practice in the morning, followed by preparations in the afternoon, and performances late into the night, left little time for rest. The elaborate hairstyles, once admired by patrons, required sleeping on wooden pillows to preserve their shape. The heavy kimono, layered and tied with intricate obi, weighed upon the body even as they dazzled the eye. Behind the serene smile lay exhaustion, a burden concealed from guests who saw only grace. Modernization brought new pressures. As Western fashions and entertainment spread, geisha faced competition from theaters, cabarets, and imported forms of leisure. The expectation to preserve tradition grew heavier, even as they were asked to adapt. Some found pride in this role, embracing their identity as guardians of culture. Others felt trapped, torn between loyalty to their heritage and the desire for personal freedom. Emotional lives were shaped by this paradox. Many geisha longed for independence, for the ability to choose their paths without the weight of ukiyo debts or patron demands. Yet they also took pride in their artistry, in the recognition that their presence gave meaning to the lives of others. Their identities were inseparable from their profession, making it difficult to imagine life beyond the floating world. For some, the end of a career brought sorrow as much as relief, for it meant leaving behind the community and the art that had defined them. Moments of beauty, however, illuminated their private world. Shared walks beneath cherry blossoms in spring, quiet evenings watching fireflies in summer, moonlit conversations in autumn, the hush of snowfall in winter. These small experiences carried profound meaning. They reminded geisha that impermanence was not only a principle of art, but a truth of life, that fleeting joys could sustain the spirit even in hardship. The private lives of geisha in the Meiji era thus reveal the depth of their humanity. They were not only symbols of refinement, but women of flesh and blood, bound by obligations, sustained by sisterhood, longing for love, and enduring fatigue. Their art was inseparable from their lives, their struggles woven into their performances, their resilience hidden beneath layers of silk and powder. In a society rushing toward modernity, they carried the paradox of tradition within themselves. To the world, they were blossoms of refinement. To themselves, they were women navigating a path between beauty and burden. And it was this paradox, the coexistence of elegance and struggle, that gave their presence its poignancy, reminding all who encountered them that beauty is deepest when it is fleeting, most powerful when it is fragile. The Meiji era was a period of transition, not only for Japanese society at large, but for the arts that defined the world of the geisha. Their music, dance, and rituals, anchored in centuries of tradition, were challenged by the arrival of Western instruments, new forms of entertainment, and shifting tastes among patrons. Yet rather than collapse under these pressures, geisha adapted, refining their arts to reflect both continuity and change. Music remained at the heart of geisha performance. The shamisen, with its three-stringed resonance, continued to be the defining instrument of their art. Its sound, at once sharp and mournful, carried the soul of geisha evenings, filling tatami rooms with tones that could both stir laughter and evoke tears. In the Meiji era, however, shamisen compositions expanded. Some pieces incorporated Western-style harmonies, influenced by music that seeped into Japanese cities through theaters and schools. Others sought to preserve the purity of older forms, emphasizing subtle rhythms and the melancholic beauty of impermanence. The balance between tradition and novelty was delicate. Patrons varied in their tastes. Some delighted in hearing faint echoes of foreign melodies woven into shamisen performances, while others insisted on the timeless songs of Kyoto and Edo. Geisha navigated these expectations with skill, offering each guest what he sought without compromising the integrity of their art. In this way, the shamisen became not only a symbol of continuity, but a vessel of adaptation, capable of carrying the spirit of the past into the soundscape of a modernizing nation. Dance, too, evolved in this era. The traditional movements of geisha dance, delicate, restrained, rich in suggestion, remained central. But dance schools, now more formalized, codified repertories that ensured consistency across generations. Seasonal dances continued to anchor performances. Cherry blossoms in spring, fireflies in summer, crimson leaves in autumn, snow in winter. Yet some dances expanded to include more narrative elements, influenced by kabuki and even by Western theatrical forms. Theatricality increased, though never at the expense of refinement. A fan opened slowly in a geisha's hand might now be accompanied by gestures that suggested not only flowers blooming, but entire stories unfolding. Props were used with greater variety: umbrellas, lanterns, even Western-inspired objects. Yet always with restraint, ensuring that suggestion, not spectacle, defined the performance. For audiences, these adaptations offered novelty without severing ties to tradition, allowing geisha dance to thrive amid changing tastes. Song played a crucial role as well. Lyrics continued to celebrate impermanence, the turning of seasons, the bittersweet beauty of fleeting love. Yet in the Meiji era, some songs incorporated themes of modernization, references to railways, new fashions, or encounters with foreigners. These verses, often playful, allowed geisha to acknowledge the transformations of their society while framing them within the aesthetic of impermanence. In this way, even modernization became a subject of art, absorbed into the geisha's world without overwhelming it. The rituals of performance also adapted. The tea ceremony, once reserved for intimate gatherings, was sometimes presented to foreign guests as a demonstration of cultural refinement. Otsashiki banquets remained central, but their structure shifted subtly. Conversations occasionally included discussions of politics, industry, or international affairs, topics that reflected the broader concerns of Meiji patrons. Games remained playful, but some incorporated elements borrowed from Western entertainments, blending laughter with novelty. This adaptability was not without critics. Some traditionalists lamented the introduction of foreign elements, fearing that they diluted the purity of geisha art. Others worried that novelty might overshadow refinement, leading to performances that catered more to fashion than to philosophy. Yet the geisha themselves understood that survival required balance. To preserve tradition in a living form, they had to absorb change. To remain relevant, they had to show that refinement could coexist with novelty, that impermanence included not only the falling of cherry blossoms, but the arrival of trains and telegraphs. For the apprentices, training reflected this duality. Lessons in shamisen and dance remained rigorous, yet students were sometimes exposed to Western instruments or theatrical forms. They learned not only the ancient songs of Kyoto, but also newer compositions that reflected modern life. Instructors emphasized adaptability, teaching apprentices that the true essence of geisha art lay not in rigid imitation, but in the ability to create atmosphere, to embody refinement regardless of the form. Patrons responded to this adaptability with admiration. For them, evenings with geisha offered reassurance that tradition endured, even as society transformed. To hear shamisen melodies in a tatami room, to watch dances that embodied the cycles of nature, was to step into a space where the soul of Japan remained intact. At the same time, the subtle presence of modern elements signaled that geisha were not relics, but living artists, attuned to the world beyond their tea houses. For foreign guests, these performances were mesmerizing. Many could not fully grasp the subtleties of geisha art, yet they recognized its depth and elegance. The haunting sound of shamisen, the slow unfolding of a dance, the serene gestures of the tea ceremony, all created an atmosphere that spoke beyond words. To foreigners accustomed to spectacle and permanence, the geisha's art revealed another way of being. A beauty found in suggestion, a meaning rooted in impermanence. The Meiji era thus revealed the resilience of geisha artistry. Their music absorbed new harmonies, their dances incorporated fresh gestures, their songs reflected modern life, their rituals adapted to new audiences. Yet the essence remained. Refinement, restraint, the fleeting brilliance of impermanence. Their art survived because it was not static but living, capable of growth without losing its soul. By the end of the 19th century, the geisha stood as both guardians of tradition and artists of adaptation. Their performances reminded Japan of its roots while proving that beauty could endure amid change. In their music, their dances, their rituals, they carried forward the values of refinement into a world transformed, proving that impermanence itself could be eternal. Festivals had always been woven into the fabric of geisha life. From the earliest days of Kyoto's Gion district to the bustling neighborhoods of Edo, seasonal celebrations offered moments when geisha stepped beyond the tea house and into the heart of community life. In the Meiji era, these appearances took on heightened importance. As Japan sought to modernize, festivals became stages where the continuity of tradition could be publicly displayed. And geisha stood at the center of this performance of identity. The Gion Matsuri in Kyoto was perhaps the most famous of these events. Each summer, massive floats rolled through the city streets, accompanied by music, chanting, and throngs of onlookers. Amid the spectacle, geisha appeared in carefully choreographed dances and musical performances, their presence linking the grandeur of the festival to the intimate elegance of the floating world. For ordinary citizens who might never set foot inside an ochaya, seeing a geisha at Gion Matsuri was both a privilege and a reassurance. Tradition was alive, embodied in the grace of women who carried centuries of artistry in their gestures. Other festivals across Japan echoed this pattern. Cherry blossom viewing in spring brought geisha into public gardens, where they performed dances celebrating renewal and impermanence. Autumn moon viewing gatherings featured geisha singing verses that blended natural imagery with reflections on fleeting beauty. In winter, their appearances at New Year's celebrations underscored themes of continuity, prosperity, and hope. Each season provided opportunities for geisha to display their art beyond private banquets, weaving themselves into the broader cultural calendar of the nation. These appearances carried symbolic weight. In an era when Western clothing, theaters, and entertainments were becoming increasingly visible, geisha embodied the persistence of Japanese aesthetics. Their kimono, their shamisen, their measured movements contrasted with the rush of modern life, reminding citizens that refinement was not to be lost amid progress. For many, the sight of geisha at festivals became a form of reassurance. Even as railways stretched across the land and factories rose in cities, the spirit of Japan still lived in the turning of the seasons and the elegance of tradition. Economically, festivals also mattered. Crowds flocked to districts where geisha performed, filling inns, tea houses, and markets. Artisans benefited from the demand for festival attire, lanterns, and decorations, while tea houses profited from increased visitors. The presence of geisha elevated the prestige of these events, attracting both locals and travelers, and contributing to the broader economy of the floating world. In this way, festivals reinforced the role of geisha not only as cultural symbols, but also as engines of commerce. For the geisha themselves, festivals provided both opportunities and challenges. Public appearances demanded perfection, for mistakes were not hidden behind the intimacy of an ozashiki, but witnessed by crowds. The preparation was intense. Selecting appropriate kimono for the season, rehearsing dances suited to open spaces, coordinating with musicians and organizers. Younger Meiko especially relied on festivals to gain visibility, their bright attire and exuberant performances introducing them to potential patrons. A successful festival appearance could launch a career, while failure could linger in memory. Festivals also highlighted the communal aspect of geisha culture. While ozashiki banquets emphasized exclusivity, festivals emphasized inclusivity. In these public spaces, geisha became accessible to ordinary citizens, embodying a shared cultural identity rather than the privilege of a few. Children gazed in awe at their hairstyles. Women admired their kimono. Men marveled at their poise. These encounters, fleeting though they were, strengthened the bond between geisha and society at large. Foreign visitors often encountered geisha for the first time at festivals. For them, the sight of geisha dancing under lanterns or singing beneath cherry blossoms crystallized the allure of Japan. Travel accounts describe these moments with fascination, though often colored by exoticism. To many foreigners, geisha at festivals embodied the mystery of the East, an image that both intrigued and misled. Yet even in misunderstanding, their presence reinforced Japan's identity abroad as a nation of refinement and tradition. The symbolism of geisha in festivals extended into art and literature. Ukiyo-e prints frequently depicted festival scenes with geisha, their elegant figures framed by blossoms, lanterns, or autumn leaves. Writers described them in essays and poems, capturing the way their presence transformed communal gatherings into moments of heightened beauty. These depictions circulated widely, ensuring that even those who did not attend festivals could imagine the elegance of geisha woven into seasonal life. For the geisha, festivals were more than performances. They were affirmations of their relevance in a changing world. They demonstrated that their art was not confined to private rooms, but belonged to the rhythm of community and nation. They showed that refinement could exist in the open air, beneath blossoms and lanterns, amid the laughter of crowds. And they reminded both performers and audiences that impermanence, the falling of petals, the passing of seasons, the fleeting brilliance of a dance, was the essence of beauty itself. In the Meiji era, when Japan was defining its place in the modern world, festivals offered a stage where geisha embodied continuity. They stood as bridges between tradition and progress, between intimacy and community, between Japan's past and its future. Their presence assured citizens that no matter how swiftly the world changed, the elegance of impermanence would remain, carried forward in music, in dance, in the fleeting grace of blossoms under the moonlight. The Meiji era was an age of cultural ferment, a time when Japanese artists and writers grappled with the challenge of modernity. How to adopt Western ideas while preserving their own heritage. In this landscape of transformation, the geisha stood as living symbols of refinement, inspiring works of art and literature that sought to capture the soul of Japan. Painters, poets, and novelists turned to them as muses, their presence embodying the balance between tradition and impermanence that defined the era. Visual artists, particularly those working in ukiyo, continued to depict geisha with reverence. Though the popularity of woodblock prints waned in the face of photography and Western-style painting, geisha remained a favored subject. Prints from the Meiji era often portrayed them not only in the intimate spaces of tea houses, but also in the broader context of modernization. Standing on bridges near railway lines, or walking in kimono past shops displaying Western goods. These images juxtaposed tradition and progress, suggesting that the geisha, like Japan itself, existed in the space between old and new. Some artists romanticized them as timeless figures, untouched by change, their serene faces and elaborate attire representing continuity amid upheaval. Others highlighted the contrasts, portraying geisha alongside modern elements to emphasize the tensions of the age. In either case, their image served as a canvas upon which artists projected the anxieties and aspirations of a nation in transition. Literature, too, embraced the geisha as a central figure. Novelists of the Meiji period often used geisha characters to explore themes of love, impermanence, and modernity. Some works depicted geisha as tragic heroines, caught between personal longing and professional duty. Others celebrated their wit, intelligence, and artistry, presenting them as women who navigated constraints with resilience and grace. Through these stories, readers encountered the complexities of geisha life, both its beauty and its burdens. Poets found in geisha the perfect embodiment of mono no aware, the poignant awareness of transience. Their verses often captured fleeting encounters, a dance performed beneath cherry blossoms, a song echoing in a lantern-lit room, a smile glimpsed before parting. These poems reflected not only the elegance of the geisha, but also the impermanence of all things, linking personal experience to philosophical truth. Foreign writers, too, became fascinated by geisha during the Meiji era. Travelogues and essays described them with admiration, though often through the lens of exoticism. Some praised their artistry, noting the discipline of their training and the elegance of their performances. Others, misunderstanding their role, conflated them with courtesans, reducing their significance to stereotypes. Yet, even in misinterpretation, foreign accounts amplified the image of geisha abroad, ensuring that they became synonymous with Japanese culture in the global imagination. The interaction between geisha and artists was not one-sided. Geisha themselves engaged with the arts, preserving traditions through performance and inspiring new creations. Their dances carried stories that echoed through generations. Their songs transmitted melodies that might otherwise have been lost. Some geisha cultivated close relationships with poets or painters, exchanging verses, commissioning portraits, or serving as confidants. In this way, they were not merely subjects of art, but participants in its creation, shaping the cultural landscape as much as they were shaped by it. The theater, too, drew inspiration from geisha. Kabuki plays incorporated characters modeled on them, highlighting their wit, elegance, and resilience. These portrayals reinforced the cultural divide between geisha and courtesans, emphasizing the former's refinement and artistry. Audiences, familiar with the subtleties of geisha presence, recognized these representations as both homage and reflection of reality. Photography, a new technology introduced during the Meiji era, also captured geisha in unprecedented ways. Portraits of geisha in kimono, their faces serene and composed, circulated within Japan and abroad. For many foreigners, these photographs became their first direct image of geisha, shaping perceptions more powerfully than words or prints. While staged and idealized, the photographs nevertheless preserved visual records of geisha life in the Meiji period, ensuring that their presence was documented in the archives of modernity. The influence of geisha on art and literature during the Meiji era reveals their role as cultural anchors. In a society rushing toward transformation, they embodied values that artists and writers sought to preserve: harmony, refinement, impermanence. Their presence reassured citizens that beauty had not been lost, that tradition could survive even amid railways and factories. They were, in effect, muses of modern Japan, figures who linked the turbulence of the present to the continuity of the past. Yet their representation in art also reflected the paradox of their lives. Celebrated in poems and prints, they were often depicted as serene symbols of beauty, while their struggles, debts, fatigue, personal sacrifices remained invisible. This gap between image and reality was itself a form of impermanence, reminding observers that art captured only the fleeting surface, never the full depth of a life lived. By inspiring and preserving art, geisha ensured their survival into the modern age. They became icons not only of entertainment, but of cultural identity, their presence immortalized in canvases, poems, novels, and photographs. In this way, the geisha of the Meiji era transcended their immediate world, leaving a legacy that would shape perceptions of Japan for generations to come. The Meiji era was a time when nearly every aspect of Japanese society was questioned, reshaped, or redefined. Factories rose beside temples, railways cut through fields once used for rice farming, and Western fashions mingled with the flowing lines of kimono. Amid this whirlwind, the figure of the geisha remained a constant presence. But how she was perceived by different layers of society revealed much about the changing Japan of the late 19th century. For the elite, the industrialists, politicians, and former samurai who adapted successfully to modernization, the geisha continued to embody refinement. To invite important guests to an ozashiki where geisha performed was to display not only wealth but cultural sophistication. A businessman might close a deal in the presence of music and laughter, confident that the atmosphere shaped by geisha had softened tensions and smoothed negotiations. A politician might use their presence to impress foreign dignitaries, presenting geisha as evidence of Japan's elegance. In these circles, geisha were valued as essential companions in the blending of politics, commerce, and culture. For the middle classes, who grew in prominence during the Meiji era, geisha represented aspiration. Many merchants, artisans, and teachers admired the refinement of geisha, but could rarely afford their company. Instead, they encountered geisha in festivals, on stage, or in prints and photographs. These glimpses were enough to inspire admiration, envy, and sometimes imitation. Middle-class women copied the fashions of geisha, adapting hairstyles or kimono patterns to their own means. Men recounted stories of chance encounters, whether real or imagined, with pride. For this emerging class, geisha were symbols of sophistication, figures who embodied a lifestyle just beyond their reach. For the working poor, the relationship was more complex. Many families had daughters who entered ukiyo as shikomi, sent into apprenticeship out of financial necessity. For them, geisha life was not distant glamour, but intimate sacrifice, a path that carried both opportunity and burden. While some admired the elegance of geisha from afar, others viewed the profession with ambivalence, aware of the debts, discipline, and hardships hidden beneath the surface. The sight of a beautifully dressed maiko walking through the streets of Kyoto might inspire awe, but also a reminder of the economic realities that bound families to the floating world. Women outside this geisha profession often regarded them with a mixture of admiration and suspicion. On the one hand, geisha embodied refinement, independence, and influence far beyond what most women could access in a male-dominated society. They could converse with politicians, shape the mood of powerful men, and command respect in ways denied to ordinary wives and daughters. On the other hand, their proximity to male patrons and their independence from domestic roles sparked unease. Some wives resented the attention their husbands paid to geisha. Others feared that their daughters might be drawn into ukiyo life. Yet even in suspicion, there was fascination. For geisha represented both an alternative path for women and a challenge to traditional gender roles. Public perception was further shaped by the media of the time. Newspapers, novels, and prints often highlighted geisha as symbols of refinement or as heroines of tragic love stories. Their images circulated widely, creating an aura of glamour that extended far beyond the tea houses. Yet these depictions also simplified reality, focusing on beauty while concealing struggle. To the public, the geisha became both idealized figures of elegance and mysterious women whose private lives remained tantalizingly hidden. Foreign influence added another layer. As Westerners visited Japan and wrote accounts of geisha, their descriptions filtered back into Japanese society, shaping domestic perceptions as well. To hear that foreigners admired geisha as the essence of Japanese refinement was a source of national pride. Yet the frequent misunderstanding of their role as courtesans rather than artists frustrated many who valued their cultural significance. This tension between pride and misinterpretation reflected broader anxieties about Japan's image in the modern world. Despite these varied perceptions, one theme remained constant. The geisha were seen as symbols. For the elite, they symbolized refinement. For the middle class, aspiration. For the poor, sacrifice. For women, both possibility and threat. For foreigners, exoticism. Their lives were interpreted through the lens of what others needed them to represent, rather than who they truly were. This symbolic weight both elevated and constrained them, granting them cultural significance while limiting their individuality. Yet within these perceptions lay the power of the geisha. By embodying values that resonated across social divides, elegance, refinement, impermanence, they maintained relevance in a rapidly changing society. Even those who resented or misunderstood them could not ignore their presence. They were woven into the imagination of the nation. Reminders that amid factories and railways, amid politics and commerce, there was still space for beauty, still value in refinement, still meaning in the fleeting. The social position of geisha in the Meiji era thus reveals their enduring resilience. They were admired and criticized, envied and resented, celebrated and misunderstood. Yet they endured, precisely because they symbolized impermanence. Flexible, adaptive, never fixed, always shifting to meet the expectations of those around them. Their identity was not a single truth, but a living presence, defined in the spaces between art and perception, tradition and modernity, admiration and suspicion. The Meiji era, though often remembered as a time of progress and national pride, was also an age of criticism and debate. As Japan struggled to redefine itself in the modern world, nearly every institution was re-examined, and the world of the geisha was no exception. While many admired them as custodians of culture and symbols of refinement, others questioned their relevance, criticized their practices, or sought to reform the structures that sustained them. These tensions reveal the complexity of the geisha's place in Meiji society. Admired, defended, but also challenged in ways that would shape their future. One of the most common critiques came from reform-minded officials who viewed geisha as remnants of the feudal past. To them, the ukiyo system, with its debts, apprenticeships, and strict hierarchies, resembled the structures of feudal obligation that the new Meiji government sought to abolish. In an age that promoted individual rights and education, the idea of young girls entering geisha houses under financial contracts seemed outdated, even exploitative. Critics argued that such practices limited women's freedom and contradicted the modern ideals Japan hoped to project to the world. Educators and intellectuals echoed these concerns. The expansion of schools for girls in the Meiji era created new opportunities for education, and with them, new expectations for women's roles. Teachers often contrasted the path of a geisha with that of a modern educated woman, portraying the former as bound to tradition, while the latter represented progress. Newspapers published essays debating whether geisha contributed to or hindered Japan's modernization, with some arguing that their presence reinforced stereotypes of Japan as exotic rather than modern. Moral critiques also arose, particularly from those who associated geisha with immorality. Despite their distinction from courtesans, Many continued to conflate the two, viewing geisha as participants in vice rather than as artists. Religious leaders, especially Buddhist and Christian reformers, condemned the geisha world as corrupting, arguing that it distracted men from duty and perpetuated inequality. While such critiques often misunderstood the essence of geisha artistry, they nevertheless influenced public opinion, adding pressure to a profession already burdened by modernization. Women's reform movements introduced another layer of criticism. As ideas of gender equality began to take root in the late Meiji period, activists questioned why geisha were celebrated as symbols of culture, while ordinary women remained confined to domestic roles. Some reformers argued that the geisha system perpetuated inequality, giving a select few women influence and independence, while denying broader opportunities to others. Others criticized the profession as one that commodified women's presence, binding them to patrons and debts rather than granting them true freedom. These critiques, however, were not without counter-arguments. Defenders of geisha culture emphasized its artistic value, arguing that geisha preserved traditions of music, dance, poetry, and refinement that modernization might otherwise erase. They noted that geisha were highly trained, disciplined, and skilled, embodying values of elegance and impermanence central to Japanese identity. To abolish the geisha world, they argued, would be to sever ties to cultural roots at a moment when Japan most needed them. Geisha themselves responded in subtle ways. While they rarely engaged directly in public debates, their adaptability served as a quiet rebuttal to criticism. By incorporating elements of modernity into their art, adapting dances, adjusting attire, engaging with foreign guests, they demonstrated that they were not relics, but living participants in Japan's transformation. Their continued popularity among patrons, both Japanese and foreign, further reinforced their relevance, proving that their art still held meaning in a changing society. The government's stance reflected these tensions. While officials sometimes criticized the ukiyo system, they also relied on geisha as cultural symbols in diplomacy and tourism. Regulations were introduced to manage aspects of their profession, but outright abolition was never pursued. Instead, the state allowed the geisha to persist, recognizing their value even amid criticism. This ambivalence mirrored broader societal attitudes, a mixture of admiration and unease, celebration and suspicion. Despite the criticisms, geisha endured as they always had, by embodying impermanence. They understood that every age brought change, every society carried contradictions. Their art was not about permanence, but about presence, about creating moments of beauty that transcended the debates surrounding them. While critics saw them as outdated, their performances reminded audiences that tradition and modernity need not be enemies, that impermanence could harmonize past and present. By the close of the Meiji era, the critiques had not disappeared, but neither had the geisha. They remained symbols of refinement, guardians of tradition, and participants in Japan's evolving identity. Their survival amid criticism was itself a testament to their resilience, proof that art grounded in impermanence could withstand even the most turbulent transformations. As the Meiji era drew to a close and the 20th century approached, Japan stood transformed. Railways linked distant regions, telegraph wires carried voices across the nation, and factories belched smoke into skies once dominated by temple roofs. Western suits and dresses filled the streets of Tokyo, while newspapers, novels, and photographs circulated faster than ever before. In this new modern landscape, the geisha continued to walk lantern-lit alleys, their kimono trailing behind them, their shamisen slung across their shoulders. They remained visible, relevant, and deeply symbolic. Yet their place in society was changing. Urbanization altered the rhythms of geisha life. Cities like Tokyo, Kyoto, and Osaka grew rapidly, their populations swelling with workers, students, and officials drawn to the opportunities of modernization. Entertainment districts flourished in this environment, offering respite from the intensity of industrial life. Geisha houses became anchors within these districts, attracting not only traditional patrons, but also members of the new middle classes eager to experience refinement. While the exclusivity of elite ozashiki banquets persisted, a growing number of public performances and festivals allowed geisha to reach broader audiences. The image of the geisha in the early modern age was shaped increasingly by media. Photographs captured their likeness with a clarity unknown in the age of woodblock prints. Postcards depicting geisha in elaborate kimono circulated widely, both within Japan and abroad. These images created a standardized vision of geisha beauty: serene faces, immaculate attire, poised gestures that both reflected reality and simplified it. For many Japanese who had never visited a tea house, postcards became their primary encounter with geisha, fixing them in the imagination as symbols of timeless refinement. Literature also continued to shape perceptions. Novels of the late Meiji and early Taisho periods often featured geisha characters, portraying them as both heroines of tragic romance and figures of resilience. These stories explored the tensions between tradition and modernity, love and duty, individuality and obligation. Readers found in these tales reflections of their own struggles in a rapidly changing society, with the geisha serving as a mirror for broader cultural anxieties. The relationship between geisha and modernization was paradoxical. On one hand, they were celebrated as living embodiments of tradition, guardians of the values that modernization threatened to erase. On the other hand, they were themselves participants in modern culture, adapting their art to new contexts, embracing innovations in music and performance, and engaging with foreign guests. This duality made them uniquely positioned to bridge past and present, reassuring citizens that refinement could survive even in the heart of modern cities. For the geisha themselves, life in the early 20th century carried both opportunity and burden. The expansion of media and tourism increased their visibility, offering fame to some who became icons of their districts. Yet this visibility also intensified scrutiny, as critics debated their relevance and moralists condemned their proximity to patrons. The financial structures of the ukiyo persisted, with debts and obligations shaping careers. The weight of kimono, the hours of training, the late nights of performance, all remained as exhausting as ever. At the same time, new opportunities emerged. Some geisha began to perform on stages beyond the tatami rooms, participating in cultural exhibitions, theater productions, and even early films. Their art, once confined to intimate spaces, reached broader audiences, securing their place in the national imagination. These public appearances reinforced their identity as cultural custodians, ensuring that their traditions were preserved even as society transformed. Internationally, the fascination with geisha only grew. Tourists arriving in Yokohama or Kobe sought encounters with geisha, eager to glimpse the women they had seen in photographs and read about in travelogues. For many, geisha became the face of Japan itself, embodying the elegance and mystery that distinguished the nation in a globalizing world. While misunderstandings persisted, especially the conflation of geisha with courtesans, their symbolic role as cultural ambassadors deepened. Domestically, the geisha's influence on fashion and aesthetics continued. Women across Japan imitated their hairstyles, makeup styles, and kimono patterns, adapting them to everyday life. Men admired their wit and refinement, measuring their own manners against the grace they witnessed in ozashiki. Even as Western styles spread, the geisha's presence ensured that Japanese aesthetics remained visible, grounding modernity in tradition. Yet beneath the admiration, the burdens of impermanence remained. Careers were still short-lived, tied to youth and beauty. Debts lingered, personal freedom remained limited, and the tension between public admiration and private hardship persisted. The geisha's life continued to embody the paradox of impermanence. Brilliance that faded quickly, beauty that existed only in the moment, influence that was both powerful and fragile. By the dawn of the 20th century, the geisha had proven their resilience. They had survived the collapse of the shogunate, the upheavals of modernization, the critiques of reformers, and the misunderstandings of foreigners. They had adapted their art, preserved their traditions, and expanded their influence into new arenas. They stood as living symbols of a Japan that was both modern and timeless, rooted in impermanence yet enduring in memory. The Meiji era had been a crucible, testing their ability to survive in a changing world. As Japan entered the new century, the geisha carried forward the lessons of that crucible. That tradition could coexist with modernity, that beauty could endure amid change, and that impermanence itself was a source of strength. Their story was far from over, but their survival into the modern age was already a triumph, a testament to the resilience of women who turned constraint into artistry and impermanence into immortality. The close of the Meiji era in 1912 marked both an ending and a beginning for the geisha. It was the end of a period defined by rapid transformation, when railways, factories, and Western fashions swept across Japan. It was also the beginning of a new century, one in which geisha would continue to exist, adapting once more to the challenges of modernity. Looking back across the Meiji years, their survival stands as one of the clearest examples of resilience in Japanese culture. The Meiji period had tested every dimension of their world. Politically, the collapse of the Tokugawa shogunate had stripped away the samurai patrons who had once supported the floating world. Economically, modernization had reshaped industries and altered the structures of patronage, forcing geisha to adapt to new elites, industrialists, bureaucrats, and foreign visitors. Socially, critics questioned their role, moralists condemned their presence, and reformers sought to redefine women's lives in ways that left little room for geisha traditions. Yet, geisha endured precisely because they were not bound to permanence. Their art, grounded in impermanence, thrived in change. They absorbed novelty, Western fabrics, foreign melodies, new forms of entertainment, without losing the essence of refinement. They adjusted to new patrons while preserving the discipline of their training. They faced criticism not with confrontation, but with adaptation, proving again and again that beauty could exist even amid upheaval. The Meiji years also expanded their symbolic significance. Once confined largely to the floating world, geisha now stood as national icons. They entertained foreign dignitaries, reassured citizens at festivals, inspired artists and writers, and shaped public imagination through photographs and postcards. They became both private entertainers and public figures, embodying the continuity of tradition in a modernizing nation. Their presence in diplomacy was particularly significant. For Japan, eager to present itself on the world stage, geisha became living symbols of refinement. Their performances for foreign guests conveyed an image of Japan that was both modern and timeless, industrial yet elegant. While misunderstandings persisted, particularly the conflation of geisha with courtesans, their role as cultural ambassadors strengthened, ensuring their place in the national narrative of modernization. At home, their influence on fashion, aesthetics, and social life remained profound. Kimono patterns, hairstyles, and gestures inspired imitation across classes. Their conversations, dances, and songs shaped ideals of refinement that extended beyond the tea house into everyday life. Even those who criticized them could not deny their cultural impact, for geisha had become inseparable from the imagination of modern Japan. Yet behind the brilliance lay hardship. The debts of ukiyo, the burdens of training, the fatigue of long nights, the limitations of personal freedom, all remained. Careers were short, tied to youth and beauty, and many geisha faded into obscurity once their prime had passed. Their struggles were often hidden behind the serene smiles captured in photographs or the elegance described in novels. The gap between image and reality was vast, and it was in this gap that their resilience was most clearly revealed. The Meiji era thus left a double legacy for geisha. On one side, they emerged as enduring symbols of Japanese tradition, celebrated at home and admired abroad. On the other, they remained women bound by debts and discipline, their personal freedoms constrained by structures older than modernization itself. This paradox, elegance and burden, resilience and fragility, was the essence of their survival. By 1912, as Emperor Meiji's reign ended, the geisha stood ready to enter a new age. The Taisho era that followed would bring fresh challenges: political upheaval, social change, and eventually the global conflicts of the 20th century. Yet the lessons of the Meiji years had prepared them. They had proven that they could survive the collapse of a social order, the onrush of westernization, and the scrutiny of critics. They had demonstrated that impermanence was not weakness, but strength. The geisha who walked the streets of Kyoto and Tokyo at the dawn of the 20th century carried with them both the burdens and the triumphs of the Meiji age. They were blossoms that had weathered storms, fragile yet enduring, their beauty fleeting yet unforgettable. Their presence reassured Japan that tradition remained alive, even as trains thundered and factories smoked. They were proof that refinement could survive amid change, that impermanence itself was eternal. The story of geisha in the Meiji era is thus a story of survival through adaptation. It is the story of women who, bound by debts and discipline, transformed constraint into artistry. It is the story of symbols who carried the weight of national identity while living lives of exhaustion and sacrifice. It is the story of impermanence itself, an art that endured not because it resisted change, but because it flowed with it, like blossoms carried by the wind. As Japan stepped into the modern world, the geisha remained, lanterns glowing in their districts, shamisen notes drifting into the night, dances unfolding with grace that transcended time. The Meiji era had tested them, reshaped them, and ultimately ensured their survival. Their legacy at its close was clear. The geisha were not relics of the past, but living traditions, poised to continue their journey into a century that would challenge them in ways even they could not yet imagine. Thank you, dear listener, for staying with me on this first part of our journey through the history of the geisha. Together, we have walked through their origins, their early transformations, and the beginnings of the traditions that would carry them across centuries. But this story is far from over. In the next chapter, we will move even deeper into their world, exploring how their art, their rules, and their communities shaped the floating world of Japan. If this story has brought you calm or inspiration, please let me know in the comments and share where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I would love to hear from you. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next part of this journey into the secret and timeless world of the geisha. Until then, may your nights be peaceful, your days gentle, and your path filled with quiet beauty.